Please welcome Adam Bromwich, Vice President of R&D at Symantec by Broadcom Software, Valerie Cofield, Chief Strategy Officer at CISA, Sean Joyce, Principal at PwC and former Deputy Director of the FBI, and Iranga Kahangama, Assistant Secretary for Cyber, Infrastructure, Risk, and Resilience at the Department of Homeland Security. Joining us again is Aspen Digital's Jeff Green.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be back out here. We have the most creatively described named panel. We put a lot of thought into those two words, so I hope everyone is enjoying it. But what we're going to talk about today is not a new topic in cyber, the concept of resilience. But what we want to get into is whether the understanding has changed and whether organizations need to prepare differently based on some recent events. Colonial Pipeline has come up several times today. TSA Administrator Pekoski and Alan Armstrong talked about it, but the big takeaway from that for a lot of us was the idea of an operational technology system, the pipeline, being taken down purely because of an information technology or ransomware attack. And so what we want to get into is whether we need to be thinking differently about the concept of resilience more than just backups and servers. If the trigger for shutting down crucial systems is not an actual intrusion, but it is merely the potential compromise of it. So we've got a great panel to talk about it. I'm going to start with Sean, because hope he won't be offended to say that Sean's been doing this a long time. He's seen it from a lot of different hats. And I'd like to hear from you how the concept of resilience has evolved in the different hats you've worn. Where is it today? The clients you work with, are they understanding that the environment has changed, and how are you discussing this with them?
Yeah, I think resilience right now is probably a term that we're all hearing every day, whether it's online or in any type of media form. But I think it has really taken on an importance, and I think the inflection point has really been ransomware and the types of industries that it has affected. So you've heard Colonial Pipeline, JBS, and when it affects people's daily lives is when I think people start paying attention. So when we used to talk about resilience with companies, it was more related to what's my disaster recovery plan, right? Or what's my business continuity plan, right? And now I think companies are looking at what's my crisis management plan? What's my business continuity plan? What's my disaster recovery plan? What is my cyber resilience plan? What is my physical security plan? And what is my third-party supply chain sort of plan as we go forward? And how to bring those components together, I think, is extremely challenging. We've worked with dozens of companies on resilience. I would say we're in still the first inning, right? I think companies are struggling with, I think they're realizing that it takes on all of these different functions within a company. I think they're struggling with how do we actually weave these components together? And so what we've been telling companies is all those 6 different areas that I mentioned, what's your checklist to make that work? And then what are the commonalities in each of those checklists? How do you bring that together, and how do you kind of overlay that with a governance structure? I think historically companies have had a very, very siloed approach. And I think, all day I would argue to everyone out there that we've heard about resilience all day. Whether it's the workforce, whether we're talking about sort of a national resilience, which many countries like the UK has put out their national resilience strategy, right? And it goes all the way down to the human level. And I think we've got to come together. We see in the financial services where there is now like a resilience officer, and we've seen some of the major banks actually designate an individual. But I think we've got to realize we're not resilient right now, right? We are doing some things well. I think you heard previously from some of the folks on stage that we are making great progress, but I still think there's a long way to go.
So if the universe of cyber incidents that can lead to a major operational impact is much greater than maybe we thought on the Thursday or the Friday morning of Colonial. Practically, what does that mean for critical infrastructure, for governments, other entities? Like, how should they be assessing the potential? I don't know, Val, if that you guys put a lot of work into the performance goals recently. Was that part of that?
Yeah, and we're really excited that we were able to release our cross-sector cybersecurity performance goals recently. And one thing that we've seen a prevalence of, when you think about ransomware, is how much it's impacted the state and local communities as well as small and medium-sized businesses. So really our focus for our cybersecurity performance goals was really to be able to talk to those communities and help them. If you go to our cyber performance goals, and you can get to them from CISA.gov, they're worksheets that assess and give you an idea of cost, impact, and complexity of, so let's say you're starting from the ground up and you don't have a lot of resources yet devoted to cybersecurity. We have a checklist. We can show you on these worksheets about where you should focus your time and effort if you don't have a lot of resources, but you want to have the greatest impact. And so we're really cognizant, because I think that's where we've seen, there's just been a growing rash of, sadly, incidents, ransomware incidents against healthcare institutions, the educational system. There's been, countless school districts that have been subjects of ransomware attacks. So we're really focused on how do we help those communities that are resource constrained but are rich target areas for cyber criminals.
I think you raise a great point. On those cybersecurity performance goals, I think it is, right, we think about the cyber poverty line, and I think about those companies that actually can afford the investment and the companies that can't. Most companies in the United States are below that poverty line. And I think CISA, with these goals, really brings that focus, like you did on the ransomware tools, that I think has been, I've had several smaller companies say what a benefit that brings them to allow them to focus on some of the basics.
Iranga, you watched Colonial from a front seat at the White House. Did it change your thinking or your internal thinking, the White House or the agencies, as to when we need to flip over from a purely cyber incident to there's, oh my gosh, real world gas lines, from needing to message effectively that things are okay to planning the physical response, everything from like Jones Act waivers and things like that?
Yeah, I definitely think it was a bit of a turning point, not just for the administration or the government, but frankly in the U.S. how we viewed the convergence of those issues, right? I think in an increasingly connected digital world, whether your IT or your OT is connected or not, one can have an impact on the other, regardless of if they're connected. I think from what we saw at Colonial, and I think Colonial was an interesting turning point, and I would also say that the reinvasion of Ukraine by Russia was also a really big inflection point from the government side, because I thought it brought home the fact that there are cyber risks. You need to be resilient towards the cyber and the physical consequences, but there's a geopolitical aspect of it that you can't avoid, right? Like Sean talked about seeing things in these separate buckets, and I think that's probably what people were doing, but now we've seen the bridge combine where it's cyber, or it's physical, geopolitical, or otherwise, having these demonstrable potential impacts on the actual operations of your networks. And so I think thinking through how you are able to be resilient to these from a cyber perspective is important, just because the cyber inflection point is often the common entity across all those issues, right? As we in DHS did the Shields Up campaign through CISA and went on these roadshows to talk to companies, making the connection between the geopolitical and the cyber, I thought was really important. The other thing that I think the department has done a really good job of, that CISA has been doing too, Congress recently mandated us to have these state and local cybersecurity grants. It's $1 billion over 4 years. So, government has money, it will give money, but I think if you actually dig into the details too, a lot of the requirements that we're putting on the money that goes to state and locals for cybersecurity has kind of specific requirements on what the governance board should look like. It has to include the state CISO or the state CIO. The entities and the agencies that are getting it need certain, governance mechanisms to make sure that those investments are done properly. And I think that all comes from a higher, sense of urgency on risk and resilience through the government's perspective.
So Adam, you've spent a career defending. You've seen it from a bunch of different perspectives, from building it to going with the customers. How has the transition we've talked about changed both how you're thinking about protecting customers today and how you design your future protections? Has it impacted it?
Well, look, it's been a very interesting evolution over that whole time period. I mean, when I started out in security, our product tagline was set it and forget it. You know, it was 100% effective, right? And that was in the days of viruses, right? And very quickly, everyone realized that more than one security tool would be required. And over time, that pendulum swung, and I think it swung very far over to like almost complete DIY security today. So for an organization to protect themselves, they have to have a security team, they have to have a threat intel team, they have to have dozens of security products, they have to stitch all those products together. It's a huge effort, and I think that's the resource required to be able to do that is significant, and too significant, I think, in many cases. So, you know, I'm a big advocate of that pendulum swinging back to center, right? You know, it's important for us to get the security experts in the security industry side together with the security experts in the private sector and in government all together. Now, near term, what we found really effective is just connecting those groups from an intelligence perspective. So when we now monitor activity happening at our customers, and if we see a hospital that looks like there's some living off the land activity going on, we reach out and connect with that hospital.
Can you explain living off the land?
Oh, sure. Living off the land is just, instead of using malware, attackers will use common tools that are sitting on a machine. Often tools that have very legitimate uses. So IT would use this tool to roll out software, for instance, or you might use like a remote access tool. The attackers use those tools. They don't custom craft malware nearly as often as they used to. So we look for that kind of activity. That's a really important thing for every organization to do, but not every organization can really afford to do that. So we look for it as well. Getting us connected with those organizations directly makes us far more effective. Now, longer term, I think there's an attack surface reduction effort that needs to happen. You know, we work on technology that abandons the industry's one-size-fits-all security solution model. We really need to get off of that model, and we could have much more effective security if we can tailor that security to each individual organization. Today, we really dumb down security because we're afraid, essentially, if we call it a false positive, you know, getting it wrong. So, great example I use is there are organizations out there that need to launch PowerShell out of a Word document. Most organizations do not ever do that. We cannot block that activity because there are some that do it. And so we've really dumbed it down, and it needs to be more tailored. And there's definitely technological capability to do that. And so we've got to swing that pendulum more to the center, do more actual attack surface reduction, as well as more connection.
One thing I've wondered is if hypothetical, well, let's just say Colonial, had a tabletop exercise on Wednesday or Thursday, and the scenario was ransomware into their IT system. Would the security team there have said, oh my God, we need to shut down the entire physical system? Or would they have thought or said, things are fine? So once it became a reality, did their perspective change? And Sean and Adam, I guess you guys probably work with you. Have you sensed the change? I think, Sean, you may even do some tabletops with companies. Have they gotten more realistic? Has their understanding changed? Or is there still when it's hypothetical, it's easier to say, I got it, boss, we're fine?
I think tabletops are a beginning, and I think tabletops are a great exercise for communication and for understanding the governance of a situation. Right now, when we're talking about resilience, I don't think tabletops come close to doing it, right? So when you're talking about resilience, I'm talking about end-to-end technical testing. So, hey, if we are hit by a ransomware variant and they encrypt our data, let's walk through how we're actually going to restore that. Do we understand our network topology? Do we understand where the breakpoints are that we can limit the blast radius, right? And what I mean by that is what the ransomware can actually affect. Do the right people have authority to sort of what you're saying. Instead of, you shouldn't be, let me say this a different way, more mature companies are able to do it in a more precision-based manner than just quote unquote pulling the plug.
Adam, have you seen any changes like that?
No, I think I totally agree. I think that Colonial is a great example of where you have to kind of shut the whole thing down because you just don't know what the impact is. And I think this is actually in the guidelines as well from CISA,
yeah,
right? I mean, it's like you need to do these basics. You need to know, you need to segment your network. You need to have MFA, multi-factor authentication. I'm going to put a plug in. It should be FIDO2 as well. I think that's evolving. And you need to have an incident response plan, and you need to exercise that plan. It's not a fancy tool you need these basics.
Can I add to that too? I mean, that's one thing that we do highlight in our cybersecurity performance schools is the need for OT and IT to come together before an incident happens so that the OT operators know or have thought through what an impact on an IT system could have on that. And I think it's so crucial that the cybersecurity personnel in both of those groups meet before an incident happens, and it's really something that we do stress.
I mean, I'll say that we don't see a lot of OT attacks. We see the IT attacks affect the OT.
Yeah, the impact.
Yeah.
Yeah,
of course, it doesn't mean they're not possible, but I think certainly for organizations that are starved for resources, they've got to close the gaps on the IT side first.
But I think there's a little bit of a knowledge gap there, though, right? Because a lot of folks, and you heard, I think, Alan talking earlier about, what is actually encompasses an OT system, and when you're talking about PLCs and what's in the IT system. However, I have been with several companies that didn't know the dashboards from their OT was actually the connection to their IT, right? So there is just a little bit of a knowledge gap, but I agree. I think there's a long way to go when you're talking about, manufacturing sectors, energy, utility, that can be done.
I think one thing we saw from Colonial too is both inside the government and in the company, it's not always the CISO or the other security individuals that are actually making decisions, right, in the end. Even from a policy perspective, as we were trying to tackle how the nation can be resilient to that type of attack, right, there was a healthy tension between the security side at the NSC and then the economic folks and political factors. So I think all these are kind of in play. I've seen it from the government side, but I feel like from the corporate side too, if you don't have the right governance models or mechanisms for, the C-suite or people beyond the CISO looking at security to make those decisions, like if they don't have confidence in the IT and OT separation or even the understanding of what that is, you still may pull the plug even if it's all good. So,
Sean, I want to pull on the thread you said yet when Adam said we haven't seen the OT side attacks. Thinking back to, when I got first sucked into cyber on Stuxnet, coming out of that, there was a lot of security researchers and others started really digging into operational technologies and trying to understand them, and we were certainly more focused on the threat of an OT attack. And to Adam's point of the pendulum swinging, do you think that with Colonial Pipeline and JBS Foods and the others, has the pendulum swung where that was oh, wait a minute, we actually don't need to learn all this esoteric PLC coding. We'll just make them worry about it. Is there a set of, whether criminal or nation state actors, who said, we're wasting our time working on figuring out the OT, we're just going to make them so scared they'll shut it down?
I don't think so.
That makes me feel better.
So when you've heard today, there is no question that Russia is very interested in sort of that OT side of things. And let's not just think of sort of what typical, I think the government, when we've been talking today, utilities, energy, OT is, right, manufacturing. When you think of smart cities, when you think of any IoT device, think of the Mirai botnet, right, for a distributed denial of service attack. So there have been OT attacks already that have been significant. So I just think it is, I would say they are not, especially from, right, 70% of, I think the attacks or greater are for criminal reasons, right, for monetary gain, right? That does not now, you're looking at, from a nation state perspective, they are certainly looking at sort of that OT side of things. There have been several, I use the stat, I would say roughly 7 out of 10 companies that I have dealt with on ransomware all pay the ransom. So what does that tell you about resilience? Right? So we have a long way to go. So I listen, I think the nation states are focusing on those things. If you've ever dealt with any company that's in logistics, if you go back to NotPetya, when you think of Maersk, Merck, right, and the effects that it had. So I think it has been a wake-up call for a lot of companies that maybe had a very streamlined security unit and understand, and that's where I talk about that cyber poverty line, right? What's happening right now all around? What are we all reading in the paper about? What's every tech company doing and what's almost every company doing right now? We're hearing about layoffs, I think.
Yeah.
Right, so it's cost-cutting measures, right? And how are we looking at this? I keep saying, I don't go into a boardroom where they're not talking about digital transformation. So I would argue technology is the central nervous system of almost every company. So what are you doing to protect that? And are you making the same investment in that to make it the fabric of your company?
Adam, have you seen any changes in the trends or the trend lines from your threat intel teams over the past year, 2 years? Where is the focus going?
Yeah, well, certainly the focus got a lot more targeted in the last couple of years, right? Ransomware used to just kind of be going to anyone and everyone, and now it's highly targeted, right? So it's gotten more sophisticated in the sense that it's targeted. It's less sophisticated in the actual techniques. What we're seeing this past year is just an enormous increase in credential theft and a focus on credential theft. And I've been following this group Lapsus, which is really interesting. It's kind of come out that these are teenagers who are interested in breaking into companies, stealing source code and selling it for crypto and just amassing money. But in order to do that, they have to pretty much compromise the network of the target. And very large companies are being attacked. And they are using mostly social engineering techniques. Everything, even going onto forums and paying employees to sell their credentials to them so that they can log into the VPN and compromise a large corporation. These are not sophisticated attacks, but with huge impact.
Well, they're maybe psychologically sophisticated, not technologically.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
Val, there's a little-known part of CISA that also focuses on physical security. CISA, for the most part now, is talked about in the cyber context. Can you talk about how the cyber and the physical within CISA are working together to understand the broader threat picture?
Yeah, so what's been really great right now is that we are working on exactly that together with the NSC. So last week, the president wrote a letter that sort of finalized what we called the 9002B report, which was a requirement from the FY21 National Defense Authorization Act. And in that requirement, CISA was tasked to write this report on really looking at the sector risk management, our sector structure, right? Is it the right structure? And this is across all hazards risks, so not just cyber alone, but is this structure the right structure? If so, do we have the right agencies in charge of these sectors? So we're starting and we're embarking on this work together with all the other sector risk management agencies and with the Office of the National Cyber Director and with the NSC on really implementing these recommendations. And so it gives us a real opportunity to look at risk, again, across these sectors, and also to have a national understanding of what we all mean by risk, because I think that's been one of our challenges across. They're very divergent sectors, right? I mean, the maturity across each of these sectors is very different. The resources that each of these sectors has towards reducing their risk is also quite different. And so, this gives us an opportunity to be able to work together again with the offices that I mentioned, ONCD and NSC, and to work with these sectors to figure out how do we bridge those gaps? What can we do in the short term as we work to helping mature all of those sectors so that they can have a more of an indigenous analysis of their own risk and being able to help mitigate those. But there's quite a different scale of maturity across these sectors, and so really. The need is now, the risk is immediate, and so we're really trying to figure out what do we do in the short, medium, and long term.
So when Ukraine suffered some cyber attacks 5-6 years ago, impacted their electric grid, the public reporting is they were able to get back up because they were able to go to physical manual controls. We're a cyber conference. Should we be talking about the need or the capacity to restart something physically and just ignore all the computers? Is that part of the resilience Sean was talking about? Iranga, is that something that you guys think about at the big policy level at THS?
It is. I think ultimately we are a mission and outcome-oriented agency, right, where we want to make sure that whether it's critical services, critical infrastructure, ultimately the end goal, right, is not to make sure computers are working, but that services are delivered, right, or that folks are getting what they need from those services. So I do think having that kind of end goal in mind has driven a lot of our internal thinking. And I think as a result, too, it's made us at DHS think more broadly about what Val said is a key phrase, all hazards risk. And so we've been doing a lot of thinking internally, not just about the cyber risk, but climate, the effects of climate, whether that's disaster management, which we obviously have a very strong history of doing through FEMA, but also those slow-burning, slow-moving climate type of risks that pose resilience issues as, water resources are depleted or other things. So I think those are all things that people should be thinking about. And I think we as a department are trying to kind of put our money where our mouth is in terms of having the government be able to better respond and be resilient as well. I think things that CISA and others put out, put the burden on companies to be resilient, but there is a bit of ownership that the government needs to have on our own ability to be resilient for how we provide services to these companies. So we've been doing internal thinking about how to mature and modernize our own response and resilience capabilities so that we can better respond to the cyber than physical incidents, right? Like the FEMA structure, for instance, is very well designed for hurricanes, but is it designed for a cyber physical event? Those are some of the questions we're kind of asking internally to be more modern and flexible in our own approach as we're making those asks of private sector.
Sean, when you go into those boardrooms, are you having that physical conversation as part of that broader resilience discussion?
We are, and I think it's important. I mean, where it really came to light, I think, and we're talking more sort of here, but I think the Ukraine-Russian war is the example where Russia is linking together kinetic strikes with cyber attacks. And then the second element that we're seeing that to me is like very unusual is we're seeing the crowdsourcing of private groups actually acting on behalf of a nation state. So everyone here, including myself, right, we support Ukraine and what's happening, and some of the companies here have done an amazing job. My question to everyone is, what do we do on the next one where it's not so black and white? So what is the role of a private company? Should they be intervening in a nation-state conflict? What's the process they're actually going through to do that? Are they actually going through the government, right? Because before, warfare was kinetic and basically done by our military. Now we're seeing a very unique circumstance, now one that's clear to all of us, right? And kudos to all of the companies that are helping, right? Look at Elon Musk, right? Microsoft, they've done fantastic work. What about a conflict that is not so clear-cut? And how are we describing that role? So I think we're in a sort of a unique time where there are no rules and kind of figuring out what that means.
It's the flip side. Sorry, go ahead, Iranga.
No, I was just going to add, I totally agree with that. I think with Russia, Ukraine too, you see the scramble that we did on the government side to do Shields Up was interesting. It's something that we're going to be able to better scale. But from the other side, I think we saw companies dealing with supply chain risks, for instance, but you had a situation where a lot of the companies in their supply chain were willingly moving out of Russia, right? And so for business continuity, you were dealing with that issue, but in a context where you were willing to move out of that conflict zone. That's not always going to be true with certain countries or regions or areas, right? Like if there is a geopolitical conflict and you need to operate in that kind of environment or have a more resilient supply chain, those are things that you need to be exercising now as a result of Russia.
Hypothetically, 2 countries in Asia.
Across the strait, yeah.
Yeah. Adam, the physical side, is that something that you talk about or should be talking about, or is it that's someone else's to-do list?
I mean, I wish. I mean, we're a cybersecurity company, so my kind of answer to the 2015 attack, unfortunately the ship has sailed. The Ukrainian power grid was not affected by that attack because they had not computerized their systems. They had not gone to an OT model. They were still on old switches, and so they were able to recover from an attack, which literally the attackers remoted into a Windows machine, and you could see, because there was a security camera on the machine, you can see them move to the off switch and click off, that was it, but they've modernized. That's not the case. So, everyone has modernized, everyone is on IT systems, and, they're doing full OT now. Going back to switches, I think, is a tall order. I think it's going to be very difficult. It's just too ingrained. The ship has sailed.
But I would argue, and I wish Chris Krebs was up here now, one of the reasons our election system is so secure is because it's archaic.
So diverse.
Okay, and there are 50 states that have 50 different ways of actually doing it, and with that diversity is strength.
There are counties within those states.
Absolutely, right? So you look at that, but I think we're way past the time of thinking of physical and cyber differently. Right? When you think of basic physical security, when you go into your companies, how many of you swipe your badges? It's digital. How many of your companies have cameras? It's digital, right? But you've got to look at that scenario analysis of, okay, if our cell phones go down, how are we going to communicate? I think that's a worthy question.
Val, did you bake in any of that, you personally, into the physical side, even into the planning and the checklists and the, I don't want to say checklist, it's a bad cyber word, into the structure of the performance goals?
So with the structure of the performance goals, it's really not, we don't take into account these physical countermeasures that we're talking about right now. I think it's something that we'll be discussing as we try to implement the recommendations from the 9002B report, because we'll have to look at risk, all hazards risks across the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and how will we, sector by sector, and also with the cross-sector risks, right? Because most incidents aren't just gonna silo and just hit one sector. They're probably going to impact another sector as well. And so how do we look at those cross-sector risks, and what are the best ways to mitigate against those?
That's another panel on the cross-sector. So we have a few minutes left. Maybe we can try to get 2 questions in. So if, again, we're blind up here, if someone could help with a mic. And I'll repeat the question just so the folks online can hear it. Mic is en route. We have a question right up here in the blue.
Test. Oh, great.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Pawazek. I lead public interest cyber research at UC Berkeley. We're talking about this low-hanging fruit that can help companies improve their cybersecurity maturity. A lot of the ways they get that is by hiring proactive consultants. As a former consultant myself, a lot of the organizations that Valerie mentioned can't afford those sorts of services. So what else can we be doing, civil society, private sector, and the public sector, to help these low-resource organizations that are target-rich, like municipalities, like nonprofits? They can't afford to hire professional consultants. How can they continue to raise their cybersecurity maturity?
So the question was, when we're getting out of the range of big companies with large budgets, don't have the capacity to hire consultants, how do we help the municipalities, the nonprofits, the smaller organizations? Iranga, maybe you can start on the municipality piece with the grants, and then we can...
No, I'll double down on what I mentioned, so with a little more specificity too. So out of the infrastructure bill that the Congress passed, there's $1 billion over 4 years for state and local government entities to improve their cybersecurity. So I think on September 14th or 15th, the notice of funding went out. I think applications closed, I think yesterday, November 15th, if I'm not mistaken. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done there where we're giving out a lot of money in terms of actually having states identify how they will use it, how they will have a governance model where they can apply it. And I think the unique combination of getting that infusion of money and then looking at something like the performance goals are going to actually be really nicely married up. And then on the other side, I think the thing that Val hasn't touched yet is phase 2 of the cyber performance goals, which is the ones now are across all sectors, but the next version will be sector specific. So I think you could see this nice cross-cutting matrix where small and medium enterprises that maybe perhaps specialize in chemical or water or something like that will eventually have a very specific set of controls that they can hopefully afford to do and kind of benchmark budget and resources against.
Other thoughts? No?
Yeah, and so this was something that we thought about a lot, especially during the build up to the Russia-Ukraine crisis, is that we really wanted, through our Shields Up campaign, to be able to provide resources to companies that didn't have a lot. And so Sean had mentioned we have, if you go to our Shields Up website, we do have free tools. There were companies and organizations that came to us to say, hey, we want to offer this service. We want to provide it for free to small and medium-sized businesses. And so if you go to our website, you can see a list of those resources.
And through Aspen Digital, through the Aspen Cyber Program, Craig Newmark has sponsored, through Craig Newmark Philanthropies, a cyber civil defense project. He's put significant resources behind it. The goal isn't to push money to organizations, it is to identify exactly what you talked about. What are the force multipliers so these organizations can find ways to get assistance, whether it's individuals, small businesses, civil society, et cetera. Let's try to get one more question in if there's one in the crowd.
Hi, thank you. My name is Hallie Zimmerman, and I'm with Northrop Grumman. I am working on a research project that's might be a little specific, but looking at how to aggregate processes when it comes to compliance certifications. And I was wondering if anyone has perhaps dealt with that, and if you have any suggestions for maybe a digital transformation of compliance itself, the processes of compliance.
So I want to make sure I get the question right. It is aggregating different certifications as part of an overall security effort, as part of a compliance effort. Are you talking about individual certifications or the certifications that a company might have to comply with part of their regulatory?
Sure, as an example, like CMMC, that would be one.
Okay, so regulatory or other type of requirements. Any thoughts on that?
So I'll take it, since I think that's what we do for a living. So what we have done is we've actually spun up an instance, pick your hyperscaler, Azure, AWS, or GCP, and we're actually bringing in the data streams for all your different compliance requirements and actually generating reports from that individually. Right, so I think doing it the old way is extremely burdensome, right? And having that ability to, I think, leverage not only data analytics, but really what the cloud brings you as a company is doing that. So we are actually been piloting that in one company, and it's I think saved a lot of money. So I highly think there's a huge efficiency play there.
Any last questions? So lightning round for you folks. Yes, no with a few words. We've talked about resilience, we've gone through a lot. The trend lines, do you think that organizations are picking this up? Are we going in the right direction, or are we still muddling around trying to find our way? So let's start Iranga and work down.
Oh, tough. I'll take the optimistic approach just because I feel like from the government perspective, we are ramping up a lot of the attention we want to play for this. So, hopefully it's being well received. But I think real life events have really brought these issues at home to home, and people are trying to take it more seriously.
Sean?
Resounding yes, just have a long way to go.
Val?
Yeah, I would say yes too, and I do think that sadly real life events have made this an issue for everyone.
Yeah, we heard that from Alan Armstrong, being brought in for a briefing, for seeing the potential invasion. It changes it when there is an actual bad thing out there.
Yeah, that's right. I think that the risk has always been there, actually. It's just that the recent events have made it clear that to everybody that risk is there. And so I definitely think the trend line is up. I think there's, as we were talking earlier, there's a lot of organizations that have a lot of work to do.
So need to keep up the momentum.
Yes, yeah.
Great. Well, again, thanks everyone. Great panel, great discussion. Thanks for all the work you've done. Maybe we'll pick this up again next year.
All right. Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.